working with these four types that we just learned about. Very important to know how to go from one type to another type. This is what we call casting. And I talked about this in Monday's lecture in person, but you use special functions to go from a value of one type to another type. So you can use the int function to convert anything to an integer, stir to convert something to a string, float to convert to a float, and bool to convert to a bool. The pattern continues for all of the other types that we'll learn. But what's most common is going from a string to an integer or a float, or vice versa. And so you can go in here and see why that is. It's especially common because the input function that we use to take in input from users, so let's say enter a number. And we're going to store this in a variable called number. When I run this code, Python 3, we see it flashes, it's waiting for us to enter something. Because as a user we can enter anything we want, the type of this variable is going to be a string. So Python doesn't actually know whether or not we're going to enter a number. Could type in some letters too. And this code will run just fine, and the type of number is a string. So that means that if I wanted to do something like print number times 2, so we're writing a program that'll multiply a number by 2, if you do scratch.py and you enter the number 3 times 2 should be 6, but it'll print out the 33 because the type is a string. And so if you want to do some sort of math operation on a number that's coming in, if you want to get it to be an integer, you use the int function. And you give int a string, and it'll give back the integer of that string. So if I run this again, and I put 3, now we see that 6 gets printed. A valid question you might have is, hey, what if I give int a string that isn't actually a number? I want to trick it. So if I run this again, and instead of giving a number, I type some letters like no, Python will actually throw an error. And you can see that error here is a value error. So it's an invalid literal for an int with base 10. What is it talking about with this base 10? Well, base 10 means that we should only be seeing digits from 0 to 9. And instead, we're seeing some sort of letters. And so Python doesn't know what to do. The common place where we go in the other direction of going from a string to an integer using the str function is if you want to have some number, so bigger number times 2, and you now want to print it out in a line with a string. So your result is colon, and then you want to concatenate this bigger number, right? You want to print your result is colon, space, and then this number. If I run this code, 3. When Python goes and tries to add this string on the left to the number on the right, it gets confused. It doesn't know what to do. It knows how to add two numbers. It knows how to concatenate two strings with a plus, but it doesn't know what to do when you have a plus between a string and an integer. And so here, if you want to print a string, add an integer to a string, you need to convert that integer to a string first. And then Python knows, okay, to combine two strings, I'm going to concatenate them together. Your result is 6. And similar example here on the screen, numapples is 9, numbananas is 7 as strings. To add those together as actual numbers, we have to cast them both to integers. And then finally, the last thing that we'll look at today together is type. This is a built-in function to Python that'll print out the type of a variable. And so this is handy if you're just trying to figure out what your code is doing, and you want to know the type of some variable. You can print out type, and in parentheses, give it the variable name. And this will show us exactly what the type of our input is. And so earlier I was saying that input is always a string. And so if you want to check whether that's true, if you don't believe me, do type number. And by running this code, if we type in a number, say 100, you'll see that the type that gets printed out here is stir. And don't worry yet about what this class stuff is. We'll learn about that later in this course. But you can just see that it prints stir. Whereas if I instead wrap this in, if I put cast it to be an int, and run our code again, now an int. Maybe we want to cast this actually to be a float. And so if we run our code, now see class float. And if we were to print out our number, now that it's a float, we now see a decimal point. So we see 100.0 because this is a float, so it has a decimal.